In the winter of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a graveyard of steel. Temperatures dropped to levels that defied imagination. Engines froze solid, oil turned to tar, and men who slept too long beside their tanks never woke again. The German advance that once thundered across the steppes now stalled under a merciless wall of ice and wind. Among those trapped in the blizzard was a single Tiger I tank from the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion, an armored giant brought to a silent halt by the cold. The Tiger was more than just a weapon. It was the pinnacle of German engineering, a 57-ton fortress of steel, armed with an 88mm cannon, capable of destroying any Allied tank at over a mile's distance. Its armor was thick, its mechanics precise, and its presence alone could turn the tide of a battlefield. Yet for all its perfection, the Tiger was a machine born for Europe's temperate fields, not the frozen hellscape of the Russian winter. Inside the immobilized vehicle, the crew huddled for warmth. Their breath hung in the air, crystallizing on the cold steel walls. The engine oil had congealed overnight, and the fuel in the lines had begun to gel. Without heat, even the mighty Maybach HL-230 engine, a masterpiece of mechanical design, was useless. The hydraulic systems were frozen stiff, and the starter motor groaned like a dying animal. The Tiger, the pride of German industry, had become a 57-ton ice sculpture. The crew's only mechanic, Obergefreiter Karl Wegner, crouched beside the lifeless engine, his hands trembling from more than just the cold. He knew that if the tank couldn't move by dawn, they would have to abandon it. And for a Tiger crew, abandoning their machine was unthinkable. It meant leaving behind not just a weapon, but a symbol, the embodiment of Germany's technological superiority. Wegner was no ordinary soldier. Before the war, he had been a fuel engineer in Bavaria, a man who understood engines the way others understood language. He had seen machines falter in heat and dust, but never in cold like this. Now, surrounded by the endless white silence of the Russian steppe, he realized the problem was not just temperature, it was chemistry. The fuel itself had changed. The Tiger's engines ran on high-octane gasoline, a volatile and refined substance that burned hot and clean. But in this cold, it thickened, refusing to vaporize in the carburetors. The Germans had tried everything: preheating lines, draining tanks at night, even wrapping engines with burning rags. Nothing worked for long. When temperatures dropped below -30, fuel lines became veins of frozen wax. Wegner knelt beside the tank, his breath freezing on the metal. The wind howled like a living thing. Around him, the battlefield stretched endless and white, dotted with the corpses of machines, trucks, half-tracks, and tanks alike, all dead from the cold. Somewhere out there, Soviet T-34s still moved, their diesel engines more forgiving in the frost. The Germans had power, but the Russians had endurance. That night, Wegner thought of the refinery back home, where he had once tested fuels for cold resistance. He remembered how certain additives, even crude improvised ones, could change freezing points. The Army manuals never mentioned it, but he knew. If he could somehow alter the composition of the gasoline inside the Tiger's tank, he might coax life back into it. It was madness, a gamble with fire and chemistry. But as the snow deepened and the horizon grew darker, Wegner began to form a plan, something that no manual or officer had ever approved. He scavenged from supply crates, siphoned from abandoned vehicles, and mixed what he could find by instinct and memory. His hands burned from the cold and the fumes, but he kept working. What he created in that frozen night was not pure science. It was survival, a mixture so volatile that even he wasn't sure it would work. But when the time came, and the crew turned the ignition one last time, they would witness something extraordinary, the rebirth of a Tiger in the heart of a Russian winter. The storm had not let up. By dawn, the steppe was buried in the snow so deep that even the supply trucks had vanished beneath white drifts. The Tiger lay half entombed, its once imposing frame ghosted over by ice. Inside, the crew moved like men inside a tomb, their breath fogging, fingers stiff from frostbite, rations frozen solid. But Karl Wegner was awake, his mind burning as hot as the engine he meant to resurrect. He had spent the night collecting whatever he could find among the wrecks that littered the field. Cans of antifreeze from a ruined half-track, kerosene from a grounded Stuka aircraft, even traces of diesel scavenged from a wrecked Panzer IV. Every drop mattered. Each one was an ingredient in the desperate formula he was assembling from memory. A blend of lighter hydrocarbons meant to lower the freezing point of the Tiger's fuel. Wegener's training came back to him in fragments. He remembered that pure gasoline, under extreme cold, separated into layers, the heavier fractions solidifying while the lighter evaporated uselessly. The trick, he realized, was to balance volatility with flow, to make the fuel thin enough to ignite, but stable enough not to explode in the lines. It was chemistry at the edge of chaos, and he had no instruments, no measurements, only instinct. He filled a tin cup with the pale, sludge fuel from the Tiger's tank. It moved like syrup. He poured in a little kerosene and stirred with the end of a wrench, watching how the layers reacted. The smell was sharp, almost acidic, the scent of danger and possibility. When he added a splash of antifreeze, the mixture loosened, glinting like liquid mercury under the dim light. It wasn't proper aviation-grade fuel, not even close, but it might just burn. By mid-morning, he had mixed enough to fill the Tiger's primary fuel lines. His crewmates watched in silence, their faces hollow with exhaustion. They had long since stopped questioning his work. In the war's third winter, hope was a rare currency, and Wegener was the only man still willing to spend it. He crawled beneath the tank, prying open frozen access panels, his tools slipping from numb hands. The steel was so cold it burned to the touch. When the new mixture finally reached the carburetors, Wegener signaled to the driver. The ignition switch was stiff, the starter reluctant. For a moment, there was only the clicking of relays and the low moan of the wind. Then, a cough, faint but real, the sound of life stirring deep within frozen machinery. The men froze, staring at one another. Another turn. The engine shuddered, then sputtered into silence. Wegener gritted his teeth. He knew it was close. He adjusted the air intake, added another measure of kerosene, and tried again. This time the Tiger roared, not the proud, steady rumble it once had, but a guttural, uneven growl, enough to make the steel vibrate, enough to shake snow from the hull. The heat from the exhaust poured through the vents, steam rising into the air. The men cheered weakly, slapping the walls in disbelief. But the mechanic was not done. He knew the mixture could burn too hot, or worse, ignite within the lines. He crouched beside the engine bay, watching the color of the exhaust. Bluish-gray, then white, then steady. It was working. His concoction was not only igniting, it was sustaining combustion. Against every rule of fuel chemistry, it was alive. As the Tiger's temperature climbed, the frozen hydraulics began to thaw. The great turret creaked, the gears groaning as they turned for the first time in days. The gunner tested his traverse handle, and the 88mm cannon slowly pivoted toward the horizon. It was as if the tank itself were waking from hibernation, its steel heart pounding once again beneath layers of frost. The commander ordered the crew to prepare for movement. Snow cascaded from the tank's armor as the driver engaged the transmission. The treads shuddered, then rolled forward, crushing ice beneath their weight. For the first time that winter, the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion watched a Tiger move under its own power through the blizzard. Wegener stood outside, snow whipping around him, his face gray with exhaustion. He could barely feel his hands. Yet as he watched the tank crawl forward, that great machine of war resurrected by his gamble, he allowed himself a thin, fleeting smile. He had done the impossible, but he also knew what he had unleashed. His mixture was unstable, unpredictable, and dangerously volatile. It could save the Tiger, or destroy it in an instant. The line between triumph and disaster was as thin as a spark in frozen fuel. The Tiger tank lumbered forward through the snow, a ghost of metal and smoke among the frozen hills. Every rotation of its treads was a small miracle, the sound of defiance against a winter that had crippled armies. Inside the cabin, the air warmed enough for frost to melt on the crew's coats. The men dared not speak. They knew the machine beneath them was alive only because of one man's reckless brilliance, and that it might die just as suddenly if his mixture failed. Carl Wegener sat near the engine bay, listening to its rhythm. He could tell everything about an engine by sound alone. The Maybach's tone was rough, uneven, but steady enough to sustain movement. The fumes were sharp, acrid, evidence of the unstable brew burning in its veins. His fuel was working, but only just. It had transformed the frozen gasoline into something fluid, but at the cost of perfect combustion. The Tiger was alive, yet coughing through every breath. The commander of the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion, stationed a few kilometers away, had already written off the immobilized tanks in his sector. When the sound of one engine echoed through the blizzard, men emerged from their dugouts in disbelief. Out of the swirling snow came a single moving Tiger, its armor glistening with ice, steam rising from its exhaust like breath from a beast. Soldiers shouted and waved as it passed. Wagner's creation, part machine, part miracle, had become a legend before it even reached the line. But as the tank moved, danger lurked inside. The hybrid fuel, while effective, burned hotter than standard gasoline. The temperature gauges crept upward, the cooling system struggling against the extremes. Wagner crawled to the engine compartment mid-march, his gloved hands checking pipes and valves that rattled under strain. The cold had turned rubber hoses brittle, and one misfire could ignite the volatile mixture. He knew the risk. One backfire, one spark from the ignition coil, and the Tiger could become an inferno. The crew pressed on. Their orders were to rejoin the battalion near Vitebsk, where Soviet units were probing the lines. Every tank counted. Without Wagner's work, they would have been stranded and useless. Now, with mobility restored, they had a weapon once again. As night fell, the Tiger rolled into position on a ridge overlooking a frozen river. Below, Soviet armor advanced cautiously through the ice fog. The commander ordered the Tiger to prepare for engagement. The 88mm cannon adjusted its aim, gears grinding through thawing grease. When the first shell fired, it split the stillness of the night, a thunderclap across the tundra. The round struck a T-34, erupting in a ball of fire that painted the snow orange. A second shot followed, then a third. The Tiger was once again the hunter, its roar echoing across the steppe. Wagner, crouched by the engine, barely noticed the battle. His attention was fixed on the fuel lines. The mixture was depleting faster than expected, evaporating under the high heat. He recalculated in his head. The kerosene blend was burning more efficiently, but unpredictably. It would last perhaps 2 more hours before the engine seized or exploded. He adjusted the intake to stabilize flow, balancing chemistry by instinct alone. As dawn approached, the cold deepened again. Temperatures plunged below -40. Even the kerosene began to thicken. Wagner knew the miracle would not last. The Tiger had defied nature, but nature was patient. Already frost was forming again along the edges of the engine block. He ordered the crew to idle periodically, keeping internal heat alive, preventing another freeze. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the Tiger still running, its hull glowing faintly from retained heat. Other crews surrounded it, studying the fuel smell and exhaust color, trying to understand how it moved while their machines lay dead. Wagner explained little. He handed a small note to the unit mechanic, a rough set of proportions scribbled in pencil. "Mix this," he said simply. Within days, his formula spread through the battalion. Mechanics scavenged whatever fluids they could, replicating the volatile blend. Soon, more Tigers stirred back to life across the frozen plain. What had begun as one man's desperate improvisation was becoming an unspoken system. The Wagner mixture, whispered between crews as rumor, half legend, half science. The war had given birth to countless weapons, but this invention was born not from laboratories or factories. It was born from hunger, frost, and the refusal to surrender. Yet every miracle had a cost, and Wagner knew his was coming. The Tiger's heart could only burn so hot before it burned itself out. And far in the distance beyond the snow, Soviet patrols were already closing in, drawn by the sound of the only moving tank for miles. The dawn after the battle came gray and heavy, the air so cold it stung the lungs. The Tiger stood half buried in snow, its hull steaming faintly from the night's effort. Around it, the battlefield lay silent, except for the groan of settling metal. The Soviets had withdrawn, leaving behind shattered tanks and the frozen remains of men who had fought in the dark. Inside the Tiger, Karl Wagner's crew dozed in turns, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. Only the mechanic himself remained awake, kneeling by the engine that had saved them. The smell of fuel filled the air, sharp, oily, dangerous. His experimental mixture had worked far longer than he expected, but it had taken a toll. The engine seals were blistered, the fuel pump strained, and the exhaust manifold scorched black. The heat that had revived the tank had nearly killed it. Wegener knew he couldn't repeat the feat indefinitely. His creation had extended their life, not granted immunity from the cold. He scraped a thin layer of frost from a gauge and watched the needle tremble. Pressure was holding, barely. But when he touched the side of the carburetor, he felt a faint vibration that didn't belong, the whisper of vapor escaping. That meant a leak, a dangerous one. The hybrid fuel could ignite from a spark smaller than a match head. The tank's very survival now depended on keeping its own heartbeat under control. As the day brightened, new orders arrived. The battalion was regrouping for a counterattack. The Soviets had found a crossing nearby, and the Tigers were to move before noon. Wegener's commander wanted his machine ready. There was no time to rest, no time to rebuild. The Tiger had to move, or be left behind once more. Wegener worked without pause, his tools stiff from frost. He tightened bolts, patched cracks with cloth soaked in grease, and bled air from the lines. The mixture inside the tank had separated overnight. The kerosene and gasoline were fighting each other, freezing in uneven layers. He shook the fuel drums, trying to reblend them. Each movement sent fumes curling through the cold air. By late morning, the crew climbed back inside. Wegener turned the starter. The engine sputtered, coughed, and caught. The sound filled the valley, a deep, resonant growl that cut through the silence. The other tanks followed suit, their own makeshift fuels awakening them one by one. What had started as a single experiment had now revived an entire armored column. As they rolled toward the front, the air shimmered with exhaust. The men inside could feel warmth returning, but it was a deceptive comfort. The hybrid fuel burned unevenly. When the Tiger climbed a ridge, it stuttered. A violent jolt ran through the chassis. Wegener shouted for the driver to ease the throttle. He knew the mixture was unstable, too much to strain, and it could detonate inside the cylinder. They crested the ridge just as artillery began to fall in the valley below. Soviet shells exploded against the ice, showering the tanks with snow and rock. The formation scattered, engines roaring in protest. Wegener's Tiger held its ground, gun turret turning, the crew inside bracing for impact. When the enemy armor appeared through the fog, dark shapes moving across the white horizon, the Tiger's 88mm cannon fired, the recoil shaking loose icicles from the barrel. The first Soviet tank vanished in fire. The second veered off the road, its treads torn apart. The Tiger fought like a creature reborn, each shot echoing across the frozen river. But inside, the gauges were climbing again. The fuel was burning hotter, pressure rising dangerously. Wegener watched in dread as flames licked at the exhaust pipe, a sign that vapor was escaping from the manifold. One spark, one backfire, and the Tiger would be consumed from within. He yelled for the driver to throttle down, but the commander pressed on. The Soviet counterattack was collapsing. They had to hold the ridge. The Tiger fired again, and the recoil knocked loose another seal. This time, Wegener saw it, a flash of blue flame at the rear. He grabbed a blanket and smothered it, coughing from the fumes. The air inside the cabin filled with the bitter stench of half-burned kerosene. When the last Soviet gun fell silent, the Tiger was still standing. Scorched, shaking, but alive. The crew sat in stunned silence, surrounded by the stench of burning oil. Wegener leaned back against the steel wall, his face streaked with soot. The fuel had held just long enough. As night returned, he walked outside into the bitter wind. Around him, other mechanics worked by lantern light, refilling their tanks with versions of his mixture. Some asked him for advice. Others simply nodded in respect. The Wegener fuel, as they now called it, was spreading fast, whispered among soldiers as if it were black magic. By the third day of movement, the Tiger column had transformed from a frozen graveyard into a mobile spearhead once more. The Wegener fuel, that unstable cocktail of gasoline, kerosene, and antifreeze, was the only thing keeping the engines alive. Across the battalion, tanks that had been abandoned days before now growled and rolled through the snow again. It was a resurrection powered by fumes and desperation. But beneath the roar of engines, danger pulsed quietly. Invisible, chemical, absolute. Wegener rode in his Tiger, half proud and half terrified. Every sound from the engine made his heart tighten. The Maybach was never built for this fuel. The higher flash point of kerosene meant that combustion came slower and hotter, leaving carbon deposits that threatened to choke the cylinders. The antifreeze, meanwhile, corroded the carburetor seals. Each minute of operation was a race between motion and meltdown. As the column advanced toward Orsha, the snow turned to packed ice, and the wind carried the scent of burning metal. Wegener climbed onto the hull during a stop, removing an inspection plate from the exhaust. Inside, the walls glowed faintly orange from heat, a sign the mixture was burning too aggressively. The tank was alive, yes, but like a man running a fever. One more hour of strain could finish it. Still, orders were orders. The commander's radio crackled with the voice of higher command. Soviet forces had retaken a bridge ahead. The Tigers were to retake it before nightfall. Wegener didn't argue. He simply returned to his post, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the throttle mixture for balance. By afternoon, they reached the river. The bridge loomed in the distance, half collapsed, with plumes of smoke rising from the far bank. Soviet artillery began to fire almost immediately. Shells crashed into the frozen ground, sending shards of ice into the air. The Tiger formation scattered, maneuvering for cover. Wegener's tank took the lead, treads grinding against rock-hard snow. When they reached the bank, the commander ordered full throttle. The Tiger surged forward, its engine screaming, exhaust pipes belching white fire. Wegener could smell it instantly, the sweet, burning tang of unspent fuel. The vapor was leaking again, pooling near the rear vent. His mind raced through calculations. The temperature, the pressure, the oxygen level. A perfect recipe for combustion. He shouted to the crew to ease the engine, but it was too late. A Soviet mortar exploded nearby, shaking the tank violently. A spark leapt somewhere deep within the engine bay, and a blast of blue flame erupted from the rear grille. Wegener reacted without hesitation. He grabbed a sandbag, tore it open, and threw the contents onto the flames. The burning fuel hissed, coughed, and went out, leaving behind a trail of black smoke. The tank had survived, but barely. The crew was shaken, coughing from fumes. Wegener wiped soot from his eyes, his chest heaving. The mixture had reached its limit. It could no longer sustain long operations without risking explosion. Still, the Tiger pressed on, firing its 88mm gun at the far bank. Every recoil sent vibrations through the engine compartment. Every second the engine ran felt like defying fate. Finally, after hours of brutal combat, the bridge was taken. The Soviet defenders retreated, their last artillery pieces silenced by precise German fire. The frozen river was littered with debris, shattered tanks, broken wagons, burning fuel drums. The Tigers stood at the edge of victory, but the cost was visible. Several tanks had caught fire mid-charge, consumed by their own volatile engines. When night fell, Wegener went to inspect what remained. He found one Tiger half sunk in the ice, its hull blackened, the smell of charred fuel heavy in the air. The crew had escaped, but the tank was lost, another victim of his creation. He stared at the wreckage for a long time, snow drifting through the open hatches. His miracle was spreading through the front faster than he could control, used by men who didn't understand its danger. Later that night, by the dim glow of a lantern, Wegener wrote a report. He detailed the precise composition of his mixture, its benefits, and its risks. He noted that it should only be used for emergency startup, not continuous operation. He sealed the note inside an envelope and marked it for the battalion's maintenance division. He hoped someone would read it before the next engine burned itself alive. But in war, desperation always outran caution. Commanders praised results, not warnings. The next day, other units requested his formula. Fuel supplies were low, temperatures still falling, and men wanted their tanks to move. Wegener watched them drive off, engines roaring, exhaust flaring blue in the dawn light. He knew what was coming. His trick had saved a dozen Tigers from freezing, but it might now destroy twice as many in fire. By early February 1944, The thaw never came. Only more cold, more hunger, more silence between battles. The German front had grown brittle. Machines cracked before men did. And in the white wasteland outside Orsha, the legend of Wegener's miracle fuel had spread across every unit with a working radio. To the officers, it was genius. To the soldiers, it was salvation. But to Wegener himself, it was becoming a nightmare. Every day, more Tigers arrived at his camp, some barely running, some trailing smoke. Mechanics begged for his formula, sometimes offering food or cigarettes in exchange. Others simply copied the recipe from rumor, mixing it wrong. Too much kerosene, too little gasoline. Wegener tried to warn them, but the desperation of the front was stronger than reason. When engines froze, they turned to him. When engines exploded, they blamed fate. The Tiger's Maybach engine was a masterpiece of precision, but it had no forgiveness. Wegener's mixture forced it to operate outside its limits. It burned hot and uneven, cooking internal seals and thinning lubricants. Each tank that used it survived the cold, but lost months, even years, of service life in days. To the generals, that didn't matter. The war was measured in hours. The 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion now moved constantly, chasing retreating Soviet forces through forests and fields of snow. Wegener's own Tiger led the column, still held together by patches of cloth and prayer. Every few kilometers, he would stop to drain and remix fuel. The smell of chemicals followed him everywhere, sharp and metallic, mingling with the stench of burnt oil and cordite. The men admired him. They called him the man who burns winter. But admiration brought pressure. Commanders began asking for written instructions, suggesting the formula could be standardized for all Eastern Front operations. Wegener hesitated. He knew what that meant. Mass production without understanding. His notes, based on instinct and field experience, could not be translated into safe procedure. What worked for one Tiger could destroy another. On a bitter morning near Smolensk, his fears came true. A neighboring company tried to start 4 frozen tanks at once, using a crude version of his mix. Wegener heard the explosions before he saw the smoke. Deep, booming reports that echoed through the valley. When he arrived, the sight froze him more than the cold ever could. The tanks were gone, torn apart, blackened shells in the snow. The fuel mixture had detonated inside their engines, turning each one into a bomb. The crews lay scattered nearby, some still alive, burned and coughing in the smoke. Wegener ran to help, but his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a bandage. One of the survivors grabbed his sleeve, eyes wide with pain. "We used your formula," he rasped. "It worked, until it didn't." Wegener said nothing. The words carved themselves into his mind, deeper than any wound. He stayed with the survivors until medics arrived, then walked back to his Tiger in silence. The other mechanics avoided his gaze. The legend of the miracle fuel had turned to whispers of a curse. That night, Wegener sat alone in his turret, watching frost creep along the metal walls. His mixture had saved hundreds of lives. It had also taken them. In war, those two truths were always the same. Yet he couldn't stop using it. None of them could. Without it, their engines froze. Without their engines, they died. The fuel had become both their salvation and their sentence. As the stars shimmered faintly through the clouds, he wrote another report. This time not for his commanders, but for whoever might find it when he was gone. He described the science behind his method, its dangers, and its limits. He included every observation, every failure. He titled it simply, "Notes on Emergency Fuel Composition for Extreme Cold Conditions." Then he sealed it in a tin box and hid it beneath the floor panel of the Tiger's cabin. The next morning, he awoke to the distant rumble of artillery. The Soviets were attacking again, heavier this time with waves of T-34s and massed infantry. The battalion had no choice but to fight. Wegener's tank roared to life once more, its engine growling with the same uneven fury. As they rolled into battle, the horizon burned red with dawn and fire. Wegener could feel the vibration through the steel, not just of the engine, but of the war itself, grinding toward its breaking point. His creation had given them one more chance to move, one more chance to fight. But deep inside, he wondered if the cost had already been paid. Not in fuel, but in souls. The counteroffensive near Smolensk unfolded like a storm of iron and flame. The frozen landscape that had seemed lifeless for weeks now erupted with the sound of war. Artillery shells cracking the ice, tracer rounds slicing the air, engines roaring against the wind. Wagner's Tiger advanced through the chaos, its 88 mm cannon flashing white against the gray sky. Snow melted where the exhaust poured out, leaving black scars in its wake. Every tank in the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion now ran on Wagner's volatile fuel. The entire column was alive with the smell of chemicals and the shimmer of heat in the frigid air. It was an army resurrected by fire, unnatural, fierce, and unstable. Mechanics scrambled alongside the vehicles, carrying drums of the improvised mixture as if they were carrying gold. To the officers, it was a triumph. To Wagner, it was a field of fuses waiting to ignite. As the Tigers pushed forward, Soviet T-34s emerged from behind snow-covered ridges. The battle that followed was brutal and close. Shells collided mid-air, explosions echoing through the white void. The Tigers' gunner fired with calm precision, each shot blasting through enemy armor. Wagner, crouched near the engine compartment, monitored the gauges. The temperature was climbing fast again, far higher than he'd ever seen. The mixture was burning hotter under continuous load, feeding on its own heat. When the first tank in the formation exploded, the crew thought it was enemy fire. But the second blast came from within another Tiger, then a third. Wagner knew instantly. Their engines were overheating, detonating under internal pressure. The same miracle that had brought them here was now consuming them from the inside out. He screamed over the intercom for the driver to shut down, but the commander refused. They couldn't stop. Soviet infantry was closing in. The Tiger fired again and again, each recoil sending tremors through the overheated chassis. Then the engine backfired. The sound was small, almost delicate, before the rear vent belched a burst of flame. Wagner grabbed a crowbar, tore open the access panel, and saw the horror: fuel leaking from a split line, bubbling from heat. He ripped off his gloves and tried to clamp it, his hands burning. The engine roared like a living thing, shaking under its own fury. The mixture inside was no longer fuel. It was fire waiting for a breath of air. Then a shell struck nearby. The shock wave slammed into the Tiger, knocking Wagner against the wall. The engine sputtered, then caught with a violent cough. A plume of blue flame shot out the exhaust. He shouted for evacuation, but the commander ignored him. The Tiger's gun was still firing, and retreat meant surrender. The choice was taken from them. The next shell hit closer, shrapnel piercing the rear armor. The blast found the fuel. In an instant, the engine compartment erupted. Fire filled the interior, a storm of liquid heat. Wagner threw himself toward the hatch, his coat igniting, his skin seared by flame. He felt the air being sucked out of the cabin as fire devoured the oxygen. Two of the crew made it out. The commander did not. Wagner rolled through the snow, steam rising from his clothes. Behind him, the Tiger burned bright against the endless white. A funeral pyre of steel. Its cannon sagged, its ammunition cooking off in dull thumps. The sight was both terrible and beautiful. A machine too perfect for the world, destroyed by the very fuel that had defied nature. Hours later, the battlefield fell silent. Soviet units had withdrawn again, unwilling to advance through the sea of wreckage. The surviving Tigers stood motionless, engines dead, their fuel burned away. Among them, Wagner sat in the snow, his hands bandaged, face streaked with soot. He watched the black smoke drift upward, curling into the pale winter sky. Around him, other mechanics moved through the ruins, collecting whatever fuel they could salvage. They avoided his gaze, fearful and reverent at once. His creation had saved their army and destroyed it too. He was no longer the hero who burned winter. He was the man who taught fire how to breathe. When night fell, Wagner went back to the ruins of his Tiger. Beneath the twisted frame, the tin box he had hidden earlier was still intact. He pulled it from the ashes, opened it, and stared at the notes inside. His formula, his calculations, his warnings. They were blackened at the edges, but still legible. He hesitated for a long time, then sealed the box again and buried it deeper beneath the snow. Some knowledge, he decided, was too dangerous to survive the war. As the wind rose over the steppe, he looked once more at the burning horizon. The cold was returning, creeping back over the ashes. His mixture had defeated winter for a moment, but winter always came back. By the time February faded into March, the snowfields of the Eastern Front had become a graveyard of machines. The smell of burning fuel lingered over the plains for weeks, an odor that no one could forget. The 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion, once proud and unstoppable, now limped forward with only a fraction of its strength. Half its Tigers lay wrecked, their charred frames frozen into the earth. Some were destroyed by enemy fire, but others had died in strange internal infernos, engines that ignited from within, consuming themselves in blue fire. Karl Wagner moved through the wreckage in silence. His hands were wrapped in gauze, his skin burned raw from the explosion that had claimed his own tank. The men still saluted him when he passed, though fewer now met his eyes. To them, he was the man who had cheated the cold and defied the elements, but also the man whose invention had killed comrades as surely as Soviet shells. His name was whispered with both awe and unease. The German command, meanwhile, had taken notice. Officers from logistics and engineering units arrived to question him. They wanted data, measurements, formulas. They spoke of production, of distributing his Wagner blend to all armored divisions on the Eastern Front. To them, the fuel was a tactical advantage, something that could keep their war machine alive through the Russian winter. But Wagner refused. He told them the truth, that the mixture was too unstable, that it burned too hot, that it killed as easily as it saved. The officers wrote down his words, nodded politely, and ignored him. They saw numbers, not warnings. Within days, a convoy departed for Warsaw carrying barrels of experimental fuel, labeled Cold Weather Compound Type W. Wagner watched it leave through the frost-covered window of a field hospital, saying nothing. The burns on his hands healed slowly, leaving scars the color of ash. He was reassigned to a repair depot west of Vitebsk, where he worked on immobilized tanks and damaged engines. The front had shifted, and so had the war. The Soviets were advancing now, and Germany's mighty armored forces were retreating 1 mile at a time. The legend of the Tiger had turned to myth, stories soldiers told to keep their courage alive. One night a young mechanic approached him, asking about the miracle fuel. His unit's tanks had frozen solid in the last cold snap. The boy's eyes were desperate, the same look Wagner had once seen in his own reflection. He wanted to know the ratios, the process, anything to make the engines run again. Wagner stared at him for a long time before shaking his head. "It doesn't work," he said finally. "Not for long." The boy didn't believe him, of course. Few did. Rumors of Wagner's secret formula spread again, traveling faster than truth ever could. Within a week, more engines were burning on the front. Tanks that had tried to copy his method, each one meeting the same fiery end. The fires reached command headquarters this time. Reports came in of entire companies destroyed not by enemy action, but by internal explosions. The official verdict called it fuel contamination, but the men who survived knew better. They whispered of a ghost, a cursed formula that burned too bright for its own good. The Wagner fuel became both a lifeline and a warning. Wagner himself withdrew further into silence. He worked through the nights repairing tanks that would never roll again, his breath fogging in the cold air. Sometimes, when the engines sputtered to life under his hands, he felt the old thrill return, the sound of power defying frost. But then he would remember the faces of the burned, the wrecks glowing in the snow, and that thrill turned to guilt. The war was nearing its end. Supplies dwindled, morale collapsed, and the once invincible Tiger became a relic, a symbol of wasted brilliance, too complex and costly for a collapsing Reich. Wagner watched the final trains of wounded soldiers head west, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow. He knew then that no formula, no machine, no invention could save what was already dying. Still, in the cold of each dawn, he visited the wreck of his old Tiger. The snow had half buried it, the steel blackened and twisted. He brushed the frost from its surface, as if tending to a grave. The tin box with his notes lay somewhere beneath, sealed in ice. Sometimes he wondered if it would ever be found, and if whoever found it would understand the truth, that brilliance and destruction were never far apart. The wind howled across the steppe, carrying with it the echoes of engines long dead. Wegener stood there, a lone figure beside his burned creation, and felt the weight of what he had done settle like snow upon him. He had saved a machine once, but in doing so he had given fire to winter. By April 1944, the snow began to recede from the Russian plains, leaving behind a landscape of mud, ash, and broken machinery. The war was shifting westward, and the German retreat had begun. Columns of vehicles churned through melting ice, engines sputtering, tracks caked with frozen earth. The mighty Tiger tanks, once the spearhead of the Reich's armored power, now limped toward the rear lines. Magnificent relics of an army that was running out of time, fuel, and faith. In a makeshift workshop near Orsha, Karl Wegener worked silently among the dying machines. The depot was a graveyard of armor. Hulls cracked by frost, engines seized beyond repair. The smell of oil and rust hung thick in the air. Wegener's hands, though scarred and twisted, still moved with practiced precision. He rebuilt carburetors from scraps, thawed frozen fuel lines, and gave motion to what little could still move. Yet for every tank he revived, 2 more died on the field. Word of his fuel trick still lingered among soldiers like an old superstition. New recruits whispered about the man who had burned winter, a mechanic who could wake a frozen tiger with a touch. Some came to him with requests, asking if he still had the formula. Each time he refused. The mixture, he told them, was too unstable. But his denial only deepened the legend. Men believed he was hiding a secret the high command wanted buried. One evening, an officer from Berlin arrived, a man from the Waffenamt, the armaments office. He carried orders sealed with the Reich's eagle insignia. The high command wanted Wegener's formula, his research, his notes. They planned to standardize it for emergency winter operations. They promised him rank, recognition, even transfer away from the front. Wegener said nothing for a long time. Then he lied. He gave them a set of instructions written hastily on stained paper. A different formula, one that looked plausible to a bureaucrat but would never ignite properly. It was his last act of defiance. He knew the true recipe could not be controlled. What he had made in that frozen field months ago was not science, but desperation. A chemistry born of instinct and survival, too volatile for peace. The officer accepted the paper, signed his forms, and left without question. Wegener watched the staff car disappear into the mud and knew he had buried his invention for good. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Days later, Soviet artillery began shelling the town. The depot was hit repeatedly, the ground shaking under each impact. Mechanics scrambled to evacuate, loading what equipment they could onto trucks. Wegener stayed behind until the last possible moment, salvaging tools and papers. As flames consumed the workshop, he caught sight of his reflection in a sheet of polished metal. A face lined with soot and fatigue, eyes dark with something deeper than guilt. That night, under a black sky filled with distant fire, the surviving mechanics joined a convoy retreating west. Wegener rode in the back of a half-track, surrounded by boxes of spare parts and the faint odor of burned oil. Each explosion behind them felt like another piece of his creation being erased. In the weeks that followed, as the front collapsed, he was reassigned to a repair unit near Minsk. There, surrounded by wreckage, he resumed his quiet duty, fixing engines that would never run, tightening bolts on machines destined for destruction. The men around him didn't know who he was, and he preferred it that way. The legend of the Wegener fuel faded into rumor, then into silence, but the consequences remained. Across the front, abandoned Tigers lay half-sunk in thawing mud, many still charred from the same mixture that had once saved them. To Soviet troops advancing behind, the sight was puzzling. Machines destroyed not by battle, but by something inside them. Later, Soviet engineers studying the wrecks noted the unusual scorch patterns, the melted fuel lines, the chemical residue. They assumed it was sabotage. Wegener knew better. He had given those tanks life, and in the end, it had been life borrowed from fire. As spring turned to summer, he stood by the ruins of another burned Tiger, this one beyond repair. He reached out, touched the cold steel, and thought of that first night in the snow. The engine coughing to life, the thrill of victory against nature itself. He had believed then that he was saving his comrades. Now he saw that he had merely prolonged their suffering. The wind carried the faint scent of gasoline through the thawing forest. Wegener turned away from the wreck, his breath visible in the last chill of morning. For the first time in months, he felt no urge to rebuild. The war would end soon, not in triumph, but in ruin. And when it did, he promised himself that his mixture, his madness, would die with it. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. The once mighty Wehrmacht, the armored legions that had thundered across Europe, now fought only to delay the inevitable. The roads west were clogged with refugees, retreating soldiers, and the burned-out carcasses of machines that had carried an empire's last breath. Among the retreating columns was a convoy of repair trucks, one of which carried a quiet, gray-faced mechanic named Karl Wegener, a man who had once taught steel how to breathe in winter. He no longer wore insignia. The metals had long since meant nothing. His world had shrunk to engines, metal, and memory. The army he had served was disintegrating around him, and the knowledge he carried, the secret that had both saved and destroyed, was his only burden. He had not spoken of his fuel trick in months. He had no desire to. The war had burned it out of him. In April, his convoy reached a small abandoned airfield near Magdeburg. Soviet forces were only days away, and the German units were preparing to surrender or flee. Wegener was ordered to stay behind with a few mechanics to destroy whatever equipment remained. The airfield was littered with old trucks, half-tracks, and a single Tiger tank. Damaged, motionless, forgotten. Its turret was jammed, its tracks rusted solid, but its presence dominated the empty field, like the shadow of a vanished age. The officer in charge told Wegener to set explosives inside the Tiger before retreating. No technology must fall into enemy hands, he said. Wegener nodded, but as the others packed up, he lingered beside the tank. The sight of it stirred something deep within him. Not pride, not nostalgia, but a quiet sorrow. The Tiger had once been his world, his craft, his curse. He climbed onto the hull, brushing off months of dust and ash. The engine access panel was still intact. Out of instinct, he unbolted it, revealing the familiar shape of the Maybach engine, scarred but not dead. He touched the cold metal, his fingers tracing the same lines he had known in Russia. For a moment, he was back in that frozen field, the wind howling, the air thick with fumes. He remembered the sound, the impossible sound, of the Tiger's heart starting in the snow. Nearby, one of the younger mechanics shouted that the explosives were ready. Wegener didn't answer. He stayed by the engine, lost in thought. Then quietly he took a small flask from his coat, a relic he had carried for more than a year. Inside was a remnant of his fuel mixture, sealed and untouched since Smolensk. He stared at it, the liquid shimmering faintly in the fading light. It represented everything he had done, his brilliance, his sin, his survival. For a long time, he debated. Then he opened the flask and poured its contents into the tank's fuel inlet. He knew it was madness. He also knew it was the only way to end it, on his own terms. If the engine still had a spark of life left, he wanted to hear it one last time before the world erased everything he had built. He climbed into the cabin, flipped the ignition, and pressed the starter. The first few turns were silent, mechanical death. Then a cough, faint, hesitant, followed by another. Wegener held his breath. A low rumble followed, uneven but real. The Maybach engine came to life, trembling like an old beast remembering how to breathe. Smoke rose from the exhaust, thin and blue, curling into the spring air. For a few minutes he let it run, not as a weapon, not as a machine of war, but as a heartbeat against the silence of defeat. The sound echoed across the empty airfield, soft and haunting. When it finally sputtered and died, he turned the key off and sat in stillness. The Tiger was gone now, not destroyed, but at rest. As the others called for him to leave, Wegener walked away without looking back. He did not detonate the charges. He knew the Soviets would find the tank soon, study it, strip it for parts. That didn't matter. What mattered was that his secret was gone, burned out in one final ignition. The mixture, the formula, the madness, all of it had ended with that sound. When Germany finally surrendered, Wegener vanished into civilian life under a false name. He never returned to engineering. He worked as a mechanic in a small Bavarian town, fixing tractors and bicycles, living quietly in the shadow of mountains. To his neighbors, he was just another old man with tired eyes and oil-stained hands. Years later, long after his death, a team of historians uncovered a rusted tiger in the ruins of a former Luftwaffe base near Magdeburg. Inside, they found a corroded Maybach engine, and beneath the cabin floor, a tin box sealed with soot. Inside it were notes, brittle but legible, written in a careful, technical hand. The title read, "Emergency Fuel Composition for Extreme Cold Conditions." The researchers never found a name attached. The author had left only one final line, scrawled in fading pencil at the bottom of the last page. Fire defeats frost, but never without a cost. And with that, the story of Carl Wegener, the man who made winter burn, ended, leaving behind only silence, scars, and the faint memory of an engine that once roared against the impossible. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.